this session on opera, kind of post-lunch session, but I hope you're still awake for it. We're going to discuss what's the value of opera. Is it worth even 3 tenors? My name is Angus Kennedy from the Institute of Ideas, and I've had great help producing this session with the English National Opera, Nadine Thompson and Roland Taylor in particular, who we're very grateful to for allowing us to put this on. And also the support of Culture Wars, the online review of the Institute of Ideas, which has done a lot in the last 10 years to foster opera criticism and young writers to get involved, go and see it and write about it, which I think is an important thing to do. Before I introduce my panel to you, though, just a few quick thoughts about why it is that we're going to discuss opera today, which may seem a slightly unusual thing to be discussing at a battle of ideas. Actually, about 2 weeks ago, we did something of a dress rehearsal for this session in Stockholm. We ran a version of this debate with the Folkoperan in Stockholm, and Dolan and Nikola here at the end actually took part in that discussion. And it was a fascinating one, a very passionate discussion about opera, and a good turnout for a Saturday afternoon in Sweden, which was lovely. But it did show that opera is actually a very powerful example, when you start to think about it, of some of the problems I think we can see in the arts today. Certainly with respect to the challenges of acquiring funding, but also in terms of how the arts set about the business of justifying themselves intrinsically. Opera suffers in that respect, or can suffer, because it seems unable often to shake off a badge of elitism and stuffiness that kind of sticks to it. It can also appear as something of a puzzle when you think about it. The great British art historian Kenneth Clark, who wrote a book called Civilization and a TV series in the 70s, wondered to himself just how strange it was that something so irrelevant and almost silly, his words, as opera could flourish in the height of the Enlightenment, in the age of reason. Why was it that something that he thought was one of the very strangest inventions of Western man, almost as strange as Gothic architecture, something so profoundly irrelevant and silly could be so popular? And it was, of course, wildly popular through a lot of the 19th century. And maybe opera just wasn't his thing. He was an art historian after all, but he does go on in the 3 or 4 paragraphs he devotes to opera in the book Civilization to admit that it does have a transcendent beauty. His example is Don Giovanni, but he goes on to say that there are some things maybe that, yes, they're so silly that we have to sing them rather than say them, but maybe there are other things that are just too subtle or too deeply felt or too mysterious to be said, and that they have to be sung too. Today, however, I think we can often see people talking and thinking about opera and being quite defensive about it, defensive about the accusations of elitism, and in a real hurry to say it's not so. Jonathan Miller, who many of you will know, is just starting opera productions at the King's Arms in Islington in Upper Street, railing against what he calls the immorality of the grandiose productions of opera houses, a business of casting pearls before pearls. Instead, he wants to find an everyman audience in London pubs. And again, to really shake off that accusation of elitism, to proclaim the relevance of opera to the everyman, to young people, to chase after new audiences, to do everything he can to make opera seem accessible, fun, popular, and so on. And so I want to explore some of those questions with the panel today and say, is this a positive moment for opera, an attempt to make itself come alive again, if you like, or is it maybe more in the matter of trying to find a justification outside itself through crowdsourcing, if you like? So kind of those are some of the themes that we'd look to explore and try and put our toe into the water of the question of just what might opera be for today. So let me introduce my panel to you in the order they're going to speak. First, on my right, John Berry. John Berry is the artistic director of the E&O since 2005. But he's been there a very long time. He's put on a lot of productions. Under his direction last year, the E&O won all 4 of the UK Opera Awards. And he also set up the E&O's Young Artist Programme back in 1989, which has been very successful too. So we're very grateful to have John here. If we just give him a quick round of applause. After John, on my far left, Matt Peacock is going to speak. He's the founder and chief executive of Streetwise Opera. Streetwise Opera is a charity that uses music to help the homeless move on with their lives. In 2009, it was highlighted in the government's homelessness strategy as an example of best practice in the field. Matt's a former opera critic himself, and will be pleased that I'm going to tell you that he was one of the 30 social entrepreneurs to be profiled in Gordon Brown's book, Britain's Everyday Heroes. So I think he definitely deserves a round of applause for being here. After Matt, Dolan Cummings, here on my right. Dolan used to work with me at the Institute of Ideas. He's a Battle of Ideas regular. He remains closely associated with our work in putting on this festival, and he actually edits the Culture Wars online review that I was mentioning before. So thank you, Dolan. Then on my left, Penny Woolcock. Penny's a writer, a film director. She's made documentaries on the streets, films like Tina Goes Shopping. She's directed operas at the E&O, Dr. Atomic, and most recently The Pearl Fishers, which I went to see, which was really brilliant and stunning production, I think. So thank you, Penny, for joining us. And finally, Nikola Matisic. Nikola is a tenor. I saw him performing in Faust at the Folk Operan a couple of weeks ago. Well, I would have done if he hadn't been overperforming for a period of time, but he was one of the leads in that performance. He set up an institution called Opera Lab in Sweden, which is aiming to educate people in the values of classical art of opera to bring that to a younger generation of artists. And he's a member of the European Cultural Parliament, which is an organisation that helped us inspire, gave us the idea of doing that discussion in Sweden and opera. So thank you for coming all this way, Nikola. So if I could just ask you to check that your mobile phones are off, and we're going to have John kick us off for about 5 to 7 minutes. Each of the speakers will give us an introduction. We'll have a brief discussion on the panel, and then we'll move out to take points and contributions from the floor. So, John.
First of all, Angus, I haven't been at E&O that long, but it feels like it sometimes. I think the Young Artist Programme we set up in the late 90s. Every time I think about moving outside of the opera world, maybe going more to theatre, or maybe to a more sort of multifaceted environment of festivals with dance and visual arts, there's something about opera that always pulls me back. It's a very personal view. I think it's such a visceral art form. If you've never been to an opera, the overwhelming experience of hearing the forces of an orchestra, chorus, the human voice, watching a director's work at work on the stage is absolutely incredible. And I see on a nightly basis people who come to the opera for the first time. And at E&O, for a lot of our contemporary productions in particular, we have a lot of first-time opera goers. There's a fantastic atmosphere. And many people say to me, I didn't realize opera could be like this. And reading an interview with David and Chris Oldham just recently, two great opera directors, David finishes the article by saying that opera is primal. It's closest thing we have to Greek theatre. And I agree with him. I think the experience in an opera house, when it is really fabulous, when the singers are wonderful, and when the storytelling is really clear, for me, it's the most visceral, multi-layered art form there is. I'm quite surprised, Angus, with such a liberal event such as this, that the word elitist comes so high up on the description of the event. I mean, I know it's a challenge, and it's a way of opening up a discussion, but it really is a elitist. The word elitist and the way it's used really is a British obsession. It's a bit like talking about the weather. You know, there are many participation art forms that have small audiences, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're elitist. And I think, interestingly, if you look at the rest of Europe, if you go to Vienna, Paris, Berlin, Frankfurt, if you go to some of the tiny German towns where they have opera houses and symphony orchestras, going to the opera, going to classical music is a way of life. It's completely integral, generation after generation. It's a natural thing to do in the Central European countries. And when funding is discussed in Europe, it's discussed very much on the same level as health issues and social issues. It doesn't end up at the tail end of a discussion on public spending. And I think there's a very, very big difference between the approach to the arts and opera in Europe and the way it's funded and the way people participate in it than it is to UK, which, let's be honest, we are obsessed about sport and we're obsessed about celebrity. And I think there's a very big difference there. And I know that because many of our productions travel overseas. We have big relationships with a lot of the main European houses. And I see the audiences who go to the performances every week. I speak to the audiences. I speak to the trusts and the boards and the people who run the opera houses and the orchestras. And there's an incredible tradition. And, you know, it need not be expensive. If you choose your performance right, it's cheaper than a football match. It's cheaper than 3 or 4 drinks at the pub. It's much cheaper than a day at Centre Parks. It's cheaper than a few hours at Alton Towers. It need not be expensive. But no doubt we'll come back to that elitist tag because there must be reasons why it still exists. And there must be reasons why opera, the word opera, and the word elitist does put people off the art form. For me, I think the arts are absolutely relevant to society and to all of us. And for me, that relevance is why I really do it. That's why I'm involved. I think every artist considers the society where he or she lives. And I think every artist, whether they're a writer or a director or a filmmaker, I think every artist considers their position and views of the social group they connect with. I don't think it's all about entertainment. I want to program work which holds up a mirror to the audience, and I want the audience to go away thinking about themselves and the world they live in more than maybe they did when they walked into the theatre. Thank
you. Lovely. Thank you, John. It's a very good start to make us think about some of those issues. Matt, do you want to?
Thanks very much. As Angus said, I was an opera critic in the 90s, and I worked for Opera Now magazine. Went to 3 or 4 operas a week. Every month I went to a different country to review opera and to interview opera directors and opera stars. At the same time, one evening a week, I was a support worker in a homeless centre in London, one of the biggest private homeless centres in Europe, the Passage. And my 2 very different lives went along in parallel and never really was interested in any kind of connection between them until one evening one of the residents of the centre read out a quote in the newspaper which said that the homeless are the people you step over when you come out of the opera house. And the politician actually mentioned that to alert the public about people sleeping on the streets right in front of them, and to consider that. But for the residents of the centre, it started a really interesting debate that night around the table. And the gist of it was that homelessness is not about housing, that the people that I worked with had practical help with housing and with healthcare. What they didn't have was a means to find respect from the public and maybe to earn back some of their self-respect that through the emotional trauma that they'd been through, maybe a lifetime in care or in institutions had robbed of them. And so this was a challenge and an opportunity. Having homelessness in the same sentence as opera, they felt was an opportunity to step into a world where they perhaps didn't feel welcome, was outside the terms of reference, although we do work with a lot of people who love opera, and to find a place where they could challenge the public and to help the public see their achievements. We staged one-night opera at the Royal Opera House Limbury Studio just to raise money for the night shelter I worked in. And the process was very interesting. The act of putting on an opera, working backstage, working with text, working with singing was such fun for the group, completely outside the day-to-day lives, which were framed by a focus on their needs rather than a focus on their achievements. They loved it. And on stage, at the end, when the audience started applauding and then standing up, for many of them, it was the first time that they felt truly appreciated and applauded in their lives. And it's very easy to forget that some people in society are never given a pat on the back and there's no one to turn to. So for them, opera started as a means to say something quite social, socially relevant, and to challenge the public. After that Royal Opera House performance, we started a charity Streetwise Opera, and now we put on a biennial production, which always includes film. And in between those productions, we work in 11 homeless centres every week, running a music programme, which is participatory and includes trips to the opera, and we took 20 people to Pearlfishers, and they absolutely loved it, and probably knew quite a lot more about the piece, having worked on it for 10 weeks, than many people in the audience. They just get inside the operas that they work on and find them incredibly enriching. And for us, there's so many strands of why it works for our particular group. It's fun, it gives people huge self-esteem and confidence when they work on something which may be quite challenging and they don't necessarily understand the story straight away, as is the case with everyone. But with work and with perseverance, the payoffs are huge when something is a little bit challenging, in my view. And perhaps the most crucial thing for our group is that it really opens doors for them. Because opera and homelessness is quite incongruous, and hearing an aria from La Bohème in a homeless centre is quite strange. It really allows people to question what they could possibly do in their lives. And constantly after productions, our cast say, if I can achieve this, surely I can take on anything else. And that means that they begin to do things in their lives that perhaps have been holding them back. So we make real tangible changes. One example is a guy we worked with in the Northeast who had for years and years been sitting in the same seat in a centre, and had all the homeless workers had thought that he really couldn't achieve anything. He started working on one of our pieces after a few months of sitting in the background, and when he came to the show, he got back in touch with his family. his 2 daughters came he hadn't seen for 10 years, and his granddaughter turned up who he'd never met before. For him, being involved in this was everything to do with getting back his pride and self-esteem. It's also, for our group, something surrounding escapism and something also that really is multidisciplinary. So one wonderfully enriching thing about working on an opera with our cast is that many people want to sing, others like the acting, and others really want to work backstage. So it's just a perfect format for our work. And for opera, really the value of it for me is that it changes the lives of people who are on the fringes of society, and in my view, there's nothing more important than that.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Dolan.
Thanks. There's a lot being said I'd like to respond to, but what I want to do first of all is just to set out the how I understand the social and historical context of opera, because I think that's historically interesting and sheds some light on why we're so kind of troubled by the problem now. There are two. I'll start with 2 different people who demur to call themselves opera composers. One is Stephen Sondheim, who was interviewed by the BBC recently for his 80th birthday and asked why he didn't say he wrote operas. And for him, the distinction was that an opera is a finished article. It's a piece of art that's then interpreted by a director, musicians, and so on. And for him, what he's involved in is musical theatre, which is more of a work in process. Something that it wasn't to do with snobbery, not feeling that he wasn't good enough to call himself an opera person, but he thought musical theatre, you change it from night to night, you adapt to the audience. It's something which is very much alive rather than deferring to a text in any sense. And opera directors will have different views on that, but he thought that was an important distinction. The other one who didn't call himself, didn't talk about opera is Richard Wagner, for more or less the opposite reason, I think, that he once said he's not just churning out operas, but creating a new art form, this music drama, with much more of a reverential idea around it, an idea that it's something to be looked on with a certain awe, not just showbiz. And I think those 2 views, in a sense, sometimes views retrospective, because looking back at the production of operas, there's probably always been a bit of negotiation and chopping and changing before it enters the canon, as it were, as an opera. And the fact that we now revere historical operas owes something to Wagner, I think. I think his way of understanding it was retroactive, and that once someone sets up this idea of the opera as an artwork to be revered, you can then go back and look historically at other operas and see them in the same way, rather than as something which is current. So I think that's kind of the situation that we're in. The category of opera has been created, and we respond to it in a particular way. Just to understand that, I wanted to look at one case of an opera being created and developing. And this is leaning quite heavily on a recent book called Culture Wars of the Late Renaissance by Edward Muir, who writes about the coronation of Poppaea. The coronation of Poppaea, a very famous early opera, which we now look on as a work of art by Claudio Monteverdi, the composer. Monteverdi certainly wrote most of the music, perhaps not all, in fact. And Muir argues that at the time, what was really important was not the composer, but the librettist, who was Giovanni Francesco Busanello. And it was interesting also because this is what I think one of the first operas to be based on history. It was based on of Tacitus, is looking at the life of Nero. And for those of you not familiar with this story, it's quite strange in terms of morality. So Nero is the emperor who falls in love with someone else's wife, gets rid of him, divorces his own wife and sends her into exile. And when the philosopher Seneca disapproves, he persuades him to kill himself. And the opera ends with the famously beautiful aria, Nero and Poppaea singing to each other the triumph of love. And it's wonderful, but it's difficult to square with any kind of not only modern bourgeois morality, but it wasn't as it was considered a good thing at the time that people would act in that kind of way. So it's odd to think, how do people get along with this sort of weird moral tale? And the point Muir makes is that it's rooted in the historical context of Venice at the time. One thing is that it could happen. Venice was a relatively liberal place. It was in 17th century, it was a republic. They had managed to drive out the Jesuits completely from the city. The university at Padua was particularly dynamic. They got rid of all that kind of influence, which meant that there was a degree of dynamism that they were able to publish things that would not be allowed elsewhere. It was a fairly rich city. This had been a pioneer of early capitalism. But at the same time, the aristocracy of Venice was in very straitened circumstances and ended up with a very weird sexual economy. The aristocracy of Venice had to restrict marriage because they were afraid of dividing the patrimony. So typically only the oldest son was allowed to marry. Daughters, they couldn't afford a dowry, so they were sent to convents. There was a huge amount of women being sent to convents. And young men not allowed to marry. So what did they do? Were they simply chaste? Or did they make their own entertainment, so to speak? They couldn't marry lower-class women, but they could spend time with lower-class women. The opera season was part of the carnival season, which goes back to a medieval tradition of a period of slackening, of laxness, of carnival, people having fun, wearing masks very often. And so people going to the opera, this is the context. So then when you think of the coronation of Poppea and who's in the audience, that weird morality starts to make a bit more sense. So here's the brazen hussy who wins out in the end and becomes the empress. Well, maybe if you're a lower-class mistress of some second son, that's more of an appealing story. That's an argument for, maybe more or less convincing, but it's a case for what made that particularly relevant at that moment, relevant to that audience at that moment. Why do we still like it now? Well, we tend to see it not as a work of interesting morality, but as a work of music. And it's Monteverdi who we think of as the author. And the weird morality has actually become part of the aesthetic experience. And I think the opera has a peculiar ability to do that. So it's a product of a particular circumstance that then takes on a different meaning in later circumstances. It's valued for different reasons. And we value it, I think, for different reasons than the audience at the time, although perhaps there was a sheer aesthetic response there as well. And I think, a couple of centuries later in Italy, the music of Verdi, reflecting the vibrancy of the new Italian nation, wherever you look, any kind of blossoming operatic scene, whether in London or Paris or Vienna, there's always a historical and social context to that motivates the audience. Wagner, too. Even this creation of a modernist aesthetic, which is apparently apart from the mundane realities, is in a particular historical context. So the idea that you relate to opera not as someone who's caught up in it, being spoken to about your daily life, but as a kind of revering audience member, that too is a product of a particular historical period. And I would argue that we're no longer in that modernist period. So that modernist reverence for opera doesn't make any sense to us, or doesn't make the same kind of sense. But at the same time, we don't have a comfortable sense of what our culture is and how it can be reflected in opera. And I think that's why it's a vexed issue. And there's lots more to come back on there, but I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, thanks. Now I know why I never really kind of got the marriage of Poppea. I think my sexual morality mustn't be weird enough. So thank you for that, Dolan. Penny?
I thought it might be interesting to look at what our cultural landscape would be like without opera. I mean, maybe it is elitist, maybe we should get rid of it all, and who would it really affect? And on the one hand, there is this interest in who the audience is for opera, and there are different audiences, but I'm sort of also quite interested in the class composition of people who work in opera. And for me, because I've only been doing it for about 10 years on and off, I had assumed that all singers were very la-di-da and came from very, upper middle class backgrounds at least, And so in the last week I did a straw poll and I rang around a few singers I know. And Claire Watkins, who's a young soprano, her mother was a primary school teacher and her father came from Barry, and any of you know Barry in Wales is one of the poorest places in the country and was some kind of itinerant worker. Her mother never got a passport until she was 63. Yvonne Howard, who's a really wonderful mezzo-soprano, her father was a prison officer. Chris Maltman, who's one of our finest baritones. Father owned a pub, or ran a pub, I don't think he owned it. And Viv Tierney, who I worked with a few years ago, her father was a butcher. And the way that people become singers is very often that they're in a school choir or in a church choir. Or, John was telling me the other day, there was a teacher at a school, a northern school, any kid with a loud voice in the playground would sort of hoik him out and, train him up as a singer. So, on the one hand, and that was something that I must say surprised me, even though I've gone to opera since I was a teenager. I was brought up in Argentina, and I used to go to the Colón and pay nothing, and you could hardly see anything. We used to kind of have to grab each other's legs so we could peer around this pillar. But I somehow also thought that it was this sort of little cosseted world. And then, of course, you've got all the stage hands. And that, for me, as a sort of, new director in an opera house, has been very interesting, because obviously they're very proletarian stage hands who take this absolute kind of passionately involved in the operas that they work on. And on the Pearlfishers, we had a very, very difficult, complicated scene change that had to happen during some very quiet music. And the stagehands had worked out this very elaborate system with lights coming on and off so that they would stop with something really heavy that they had to hold up like that until the light came up again and they could move on. And when they would see me, they'd say, "How did we do tonight?" And there was actually one night where somebody dropped something and they then had a fist fight around the side. So don't listen to this, John. Two of the guys actually punching each other because one of them had made a noise and had disturbed the aria. And Dr. Atomic, which was the other opera that I directed at ENO, which is a contemporary piece about the Manhattan Project. And, it's contemporary music, it's not familiar. And I was really moved that a whole group of the stagehands who initially were saying, we don't like this, had suddenly got more and more drawn into it and went to see it on their night off, And that's again, it's all part of the sort of opera world, which has always also been a place, it's very interesting hearing about Venice, a place which has been very comfortable for gay people. And, and I think that that's not a negligible thing, and there have been periods, and actually I think we're in a period now, where very high incidence of gay teens committing suicide and so on, and bullying, that there should be places which are welcoming, not just to young men who are not allowed to get married, and it's a very tolerant, very kind of passionate place in which music is made. And Matt was talking about people stepping over homeless people to go to the opera. And I was actually, while I was directing the Pearlfishers, also making a documentary about homeless people. So I knew the people who slept on the steps of ENO. And people thought that I would find that somehow embarrassing, or it must be very difficult. But why would it be difficult? We would talk. And in fact, there's a man who regularly, he's outside the ENO, if you go to it on the right-hand side, and he quietly and hopefully sells the big issue, because people occasionally give him tickets, which is why he chooses this patch. And he's seen virtually everything. And I had a chat with him because I knew that somebody had given him a ticket to the Pearlfishers, and he wasn't wanting to flatter me too much. He said, well, it was 50-50 whether it was that or the Magic Flute being his favourite opera. But it's not something that really you need to know anything about in order to enjoy it. I think that it is this sort of overpoweringly kind of seductive experience. And, now that there's talk about cutting music classes in state schools, well, that means that children who might be turned on to it won't be, so then we needn't really worry about them. We needn't worry about the fact people who work in the orchestras actually earn very small wages. And I have a friend who works in the orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, and I think and she has a double bass. And to go to a rehearsal, I think it's sort of 80 quid or something like that, but because you can't take a double bass very you know, valuable instrument on the tube, she obviously has to drive, she has to pay 60 quid or whatever it is for parking space, and people are left actually with very little at the end of it. So the people that you'd be affecting, certainly in terms of how, who work in opera, are not elitist people who are rolling in money, they're people who have a passion for what they do. And, you know, what would be, and cutting the education departments, that's another thing that I've heard about recently, saying, why do all these opera houses and art centres need to have education departments? What the education departments actually do is outreach work to encourage people to feel that they can come into these places and that there's something for them. And I think that work is really crucial, because it shouldn't just be the preserve of very, very wealthy people, which is exactly what would happen if you removed all the subsidies. Certainly David Cameron and Nick Clegg would be able to continue going, but you can pretty much guarantee that nobody else would be able to afford it. And I guess what we would be left with is Take That. Because Take That were a boy band many years ago, and they're back, so fantastic, and they can fill Wembley, and they don't need any subsidies, and we could all eat raspberry creams and drink cherry cola and enjoy Take That, and I think that would be a sad day.
The Democratic Party has recently been given a 5% electorate inside the Swedish parliament. Essentially, they're a one-issue party. All they want is to preserve Swedish culture, and that includes expatriatizing, well, throwing out all the non-Swedes. And I started thinking, would that be me? My dad is from Croatia, sure, and my name is quite weird for Swedish people, Nikola Matisic. But I'm born in Stockholm. I don't speak hardly any Croatian, and I have a very strong Stockholm dialect. And most of all, I consider myself quite a cultured individual, not on par with Sir Peter Ustinov, somebody like that, but still. So when I discuss different issues with people that sympathize with this National Democratic Party, I constantly feel as if I'm generally more educated and more culturally informed than they. And my gut reaction essentially is that they don't understand these issues they're talking about. And that this kind of cultural ignorance and frustration is their driving force. So not only are they against people from different cultures, but they're also very much against modern theater, dance and opera, and all other kinds of art that cause distress. So funding for this type of expression, they would have irrevocably stopped. And this is a dynamic force that easily can become destructive because of the raw emotional power that it possesses. And this is also the theme of if you know it, the Gary Oldman movie Nil by Mouth. What boils down to is that there's an anger and even fear of that which they don't understand and they don't feel a part of. So going back to the title of this panel discussion, is opera worth it? The question of economical worth of any cultural occurrence is confusing the issue, I think, because is there really anything in our culture that is entirely ubiquitous? With that, I mean of gravest relevance to our survival as a species. Otherwise, I'm not sure what that important means. And that definition is quite important to this kind of discussion. Remember that we consider many things important in our culture that is not proven to be essential to our survival, but nonetheless it's taken for granted as something of utmost importance. These things can be, for instance, kids, our native language. You might not be touched by this so much, but at least the Swedish language is already an endangered species, I would say. Privacy, old age, none of these things can be defended as essentially dynamics of our culture, primarily out of financial reasons. We defend these cultural expressions of our humanity out of purely emotional factors. And they are expressions of our humanity, sometimes very costly. In fact, no cultural dynamic is a force of nature in the sense that it is entirely essential to our present existence. We can exist perfectly without any of these above-mentioned phenomena. And essentially, no one will perish if all the opera houses and orchestras are shut down. So many people forget that all things that exist in our culture are entirely dependent in every human generation of the conscious perpetuation of individuals, not institutions. No institution can keep an art or a cultural phenomena alive. So we, human individuals, have to do that. And I want to make a point that it's not the artists that keep an art form alive, it's the audience. It's the lovers of the art that keep the art form alive. And we also have the very effective power to destroy and remove all cultural expressions, which the conquistadors proved very well. The modern technology has proven that too. And as we every day witness, when older generations struggle with the new speak and new ways of life. So my conclusion on all this is that the art of opera may not last, and it won't unless we, as practitioners, because I'm an opera singer presently, we, not as disguised artists, take part of society, but as opera singers, as artists, as performers, or all the other professions within this art form. We're seeing opera houses shut down, grand orchestras too. Now, presently in Holland, there's a very realistic threat of major cutbacks regarding the music center, which hosts a lot of different orchestras and choruses. And that's going to be the end of it. People don't just go somewhere else. They start doing something else. And this has been ongoing. So the fact that we are having this discussion right now is a bit like discussing the size of the breach while the Titanic is sinking and people are already bailing. But I refuse to believe that it's too late. And so why are they shutting down? Of course, there's money everywhere in society. We spend billions drilling holes through the ground in order to save a few minutes of traveling time. We spend millions on prospecting new libraries. Just a few months ago, the company responsible for the bus stop infrastructure in Stockholm decided to upgrade all the bus stops at the cost of a little more than 1 billion crowns, just because of the aesthetic. So I consider that a cultural decision more than anything else. And let's say my favorite example is the International Space Station, which is the most costly structure, the most expensive structure ever built in human history. So there is money. That's not the issue. It's just that our business has relied on public education and public institutions to educate and promote our art. But they don't any longer. So that's why funding has been slowly disappearing, and it will continue to disappear unless we as a business learn how to become a creative part of society. And I think we are catastrophically inept at this. And learn how to communicate the core values of opera and classical music. Our efforts need to be funneled into the creation of stable grassroots support communities, which have been mentioned here earlier. And if we don't do that, the art form will surely die out, and the world will just go on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a lot there. I'm just going to throw out some very quick questions to the panel and then over to you. John, if I can just bring it back to you, the question you were raising, or both to me and to yourself, I think, in terms of why does the elitist tag continue to stick? I wonder what you think. I was just looking at an article that Alex Ross, the music critic, wrote in the New York Times last month. The Los Angeles Opera had put on a big performance of Wagner, costing $31 million. It got embroiled in a discussion about anti-Semitism, and David Byrne from Talking Heads kind of blogged on it and said, why are we wasting our money on this kind of thing? There's a much greater value for humanity in empowering folks, ordinary folks, not those dead white guys, but empowering ordinary folks to go out and make and create themselves than there is in teaching them the canon. So why is there that kind of resonance, that anti-elitist reaction to something that, as you rightly say, at 31 million is not actually a great expense to put on Wagner?
I mean, I think just to go back to Nikola's point, there are certain things in life which are absolutely crucial. And that includes being able to breathe, eat, and drink. But for many people, and I think many people don't know it, listening to music and a connection with the arts in some sort of way can also be life and death too. And I think, you know, without the arts all around us, there would be a lot, we'd be as a society, we'd be in a more serious mess. And I think, you know, during the period of discussions about funding, the one question that was never really asked is what can the arts do for the government? If you look at the serious cuts that are ahead, if you look at the serious disadvantages certain communities and individuals are going to be facing over these next years, I think actually the arts can box well above its weight and be there for people who are struggling with society and communities who are facing huge challenges. So I think without knowing it, music, opera or whatever is the question of life and death for some people, and we don't seem to really speak strongly enough about what we can do for the government and all of our social changes. It's always the other way around. It's what can the government give the arts to be able to succeed and exist, and rarely the other way around.
Matt, can I kind of throw that one on to you in a form? Because you were explaining, I think, very well that involving homeless people in opera can restore a sense of self-esteem, bring people together, make them feel proud about themselves, take part in the world again. Is there something peculiar to opera that makes that possible? Because it occurs to me to be slightly provocative that joining the army might have the same effect. You know, that could restore a sense of pride and self-esteem, build shared values and community. So if it comes to funding, maybe we should put money into both opera and the army? Or is there something better about opera than short, sharp shocks?
Well, it's ironic you use that as an illustration, because about 25% of rough sleepers are ex-military. It's something I'm very sensitive about, because I told you about the story of how we started, and I'm always keen that all of our cast have a choice of what they do, and so we perform a lot of different kinds of music. And we always ask them, do you still like opera? It's clearly got a very important sort of social dimension to what we do. And every single time they come back and say, yeah, opera is the thing that we enjoy the most, singing. It's the whole experience. Opera means everything. And it's just a combination of the spectacle, the stories, the beauty of the music. Nothing comes close to them.
Dolan, you seem to be suggesting, if I followed you right, that we've lost a sense of reverence, that we're in a position that we could be looking back. But is there a danger there that you kind of ossify opera of the past, that the canon becomes something that we should be reverential to and kind of put it in a museum and look after it and tend it and make sure that it doesn't die? Is that enough, or were you saying more? Do you think it can continue to live?
I wouldn't argue to restore reverence. I mean, I think modernism is a moment that has passed, and there are elements of it that you might want to look to it. But it's not a case of restoring in a kind of antique kind of way. But the point is that we neither have that reverential idea of opera very strongly, nor a kind of folksy, everyday sense of opera. I mean, maybe this is something that's different in Central Europe. But I think the pub opera idea is very interesting and it has a lot of potential, but it's not yet a kind of vibrant scene that you can really point to. And that's always a possibility, that high art can draw on more popular forms, particularly where there's some dynamism behind it. But I think, particularly about Britain, the kind of society Britain is, it's quite disaggregated. It's not that we have folk culture in an identifiable way. And so it does tend to be quite top-down, talking about the high arts. I would say that, in terms of elitism, why not turn it around and say, yes, opera is elite, great, it's the best. It's better than take that. Because unless you think that, what's the point? Why not just let it evolve with people like this or they like that? You go to an opera, you're seeing people who've spent years training and learning how to do this stuff. Repertoire which has been either valued through history or created by someone who's esteemed now. It's not just karaoke, it's something special. And I think there has to be some value for that. But I think we seem to be very uncomfortable making that kind of argument. To say that, to say that it is. Penny was very forthright in saying it's something which is more valuable to take that. So something to be valued as an artwork, as an art form rather. Saying opera itself matters, not just it matters that people get together and have a nice time listening to music and so on, but this particular way of doing it is worth preserving and developing. Well, why? Why not just say, well, opera's had it, let's see what's in it?
So, Penny, what's your response to that? You went out on a limb and take that over here and opera up here, but you also said that you don't need to know anything in particular about opera to enjoy it. You need to know a lot about opera to put it on. In terms of being an audience, is it true that you can just turn up and not know anything about it and get the same amount, or would you think that if you start to know something more about it, you get more out of it?
I think it's like anything. Even watching tennis or football, once you understand the game, and say with football you're noticing what's happening off the ball, you get a lot more out of it. But you can still, many people just watch the World Cup and see who scores the goal, and that's fine as well. So obviously with opera, the more you go, the more subtleties you understand, and in a sense maybe the more you get out of it. But I'm not even sure about that, because I've many times, because I'm very passionate about opera, and I really do believe that everybody can enjoy it, have taken people from wildly different backgrounds. I did a hip-hop film a couple of years ago, and I took a lot of these young black guys from the inner city Birmingham, and they were absolutely blown away. And I don't think you can really duplicate that experience the first time you walk in somewhere. And it is, I love the idea of pub opera, but it is also wonderful to go into the Coliseum or the Opera House, and you feel special just being there, and the acoustics are great, and you're seeing this magical thing happen, and it really does blow people away. And that's something, that's such a joy, really, to experience with people. And certainly at ENO and Opera North and WNO, you go, and they're very audiences who are not all draped head to toe in fabulously expensive things, and who are having that experience for the first time. So I think you don't, but it is expensive, and some things you have to pay for. Take That don't need subsidies, so it doesn't matter what I say about them, they will carry on regardless. But I think there are some things, as Nikola said, which are worth fighting for, and I absolutely think that opera shouldn't be, if we're saying it's as wonderful, and there must be other people in this room as well who've been moved to tears many times by performances, why should that just be the preserve of people who can pay £500 a ticket, which is what will happen if all the subsidies go?
Nikola, very quickly before we open this up, give me your thoughts on how we do make judgments about opera. If we don't do them in terms of economic value or even social value, if they're one of those things that's just too important, what gives us the basis to say that was a good one and that wasn't? How do we judge them?
Well, I think it comes down to that a few practical issues that the demands of a production or a piece of music requires a certain kind of training and preparation. And also the fact that essentially, opera is an emotional art form. As I've said earlier, we communicate at the time of a performance through emotions, not so much through intellectual discussion and debate. The intellectual process happens before the production, the performance. And if we have an emotional reaction to a performance, then we have attained the purpose of the production. And I think that essentially the art form of opera is based on human biological functions. We communicate with a voice from the moment we are born. And there's a physical reaction in the parents. There's a physical reaction in everybody when the baby screams. And that's essentially the power that we're honing through the training. That innate reaction in the human body. And we are helping that through the theater, which is an instrument in itself. And if we as performers have, and together with the composer and the director and everybody, the conductor, if we have done the intellectual process and the training, which takes many years, and then we allow the emotional communication to happen. I'm sorry if this sounds too much hocus pocus, but I hope you're with me. And then if we have managed to make the communication purely emotional, then I would say that that's a high quality performance.
Who'd like to speak? Okay, so there's a hand in the middle just there, lady in the grey, and then a gentleman down here on my right.
Hi, thanks. I think the confusion about opera reflects a profound sense of cultural crisis, I think, as people have said, but also a certain sort of staticity or ossification within culture more broadly. And I think that perhaps might run across both what we think of as being traditional elite art forms and in terms of what we think of as being traditional popular art forms. So I think that the distinction between those two has been eroded, and that's not really beneficial for anybody or for either side of the art form. And I think in that, opera has become just another sort of music that you listen to. Some people like opera, some people like take that. And I think we're quite embarrassed about making any clear value judgment, and also are sort of grasping for the grounds to make a value judgment, that there is something better about opera than other sorts of art. I think in that it's worth pointing out that there are different versions of elitism or different sorts of elitism. I like to distinguish between bad elitism and good elitism, and I like the good elitism, which is very much about that aspiration to create something truly brilliant. And I think opera can do that, yet I think today we tend to think of elitism in terms of having a very small audience, as if something is elite only so far as only a few people listen to it. And I think opera itself is actually guilty of that in certain ways. And certainly when you look at the history of opera, I think there's a sort of an ambivalence in it. Certainly thinking about opera in Italy, when you look at a composer like Puccini or Verdi, historically trying to popularise opera actually came under quite a lot of fire from within opera itself for doing that and trying to create new audiences. So I think that there is something there that we're maybe a bit worried that if a lot of people start listening to opera, it will somehow become vulgarised. And I think that's quite a negative sort of thing to say. There's nothing wrong with everybody listening to opera. We could do that. And finally, I think it is significant there aren't so many new operas being written, which does sometimes mean that we think about the case for opera in terms of a sort of preservationist case. I don't have a problem with that. But I'm not so sure there is so much innovation in terms of new composers who certainly historically have driven opera, coming out, creating new things that people can listen to.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman here, and then do keep your hands up and I can see down here at the front and then back there on my left. Thanks.
I speak as an ex-director of music of a secondary school, and I'm now writing up my PhD in musicology full-time. You can draw your own conclusions from that. But I have two very quick points, and I don't think they're going to be controversial given what the panel have been saying. The first is this notion of relevance can be a fallacy. I don't think we always need to wrestle with relevance, particularly with opera. artworks don't just die, they have a life beyond their inception. And sometimes I don't think we need to worry if we are staggered or surprised by the message of the opera. That's the first point. And the second point is that if relevance is something that we do covet, then so many operas do have a ringing relevance. The example I'm thinking of is Cosi fan tutti, and I'm teaching a lecture at Southampton University on this week. And yes, one of the things I will say is that it tells us a lot about the 18th century, but the overriding message will be that it tells us about the human condition now. Its relevance is striking.
Thank you. Yes, and here, and then...
I'm glad Dolan mentioned singing in the end, because I thought I'm glad Dolan mentioned singing in the end, because I thought no one is talking about librettos and music, but surely the stars of opera have always been the singers, the Caruso and Callas and so on, and they were, they've always been. Opera tradition has been actually a popular genre, very popular. I come from Italy, so maybe I feel that a bit more. I have a grandmother who never went past primary education, but she keeps talking about the difference between the way Caruso and Gigli sang, or Pavarotti, and so it didn't. The point has been made that it wasn't always elitist, but it's very important that we actually ask that question. Can we say that then opera is the highest form of singing, that it is the best, or some of the best that has been achieved? Can we make the case that it's best, that it's better not just than Take That, but can we make the case that it's better perhaps than Billie Holiday or Aretha Franklin? Can we compare this form of music, or a more authentic form of music, something I consider more authentic, say Ladysmith, Black Mambazo, the choir, the South African choir. Can we compare this form of music? Can we make a case for opera being the best or among the best, and that's why it's valuable? I think that, and finally, a question to Nikola. He suggested that opera has been undermined by ignorant people, but I've got the feeling, can the elites actually believe in opera and promote? Not really what I said. Sorry, that's how I understood it. In terms of the social nationalists, the people in Sweden that are against opera. Is it more that educated people do not believe in opera, or I'm not sure how to promote it?
Okay, so there's a gentleman back on the left, lady behind him, that will be convenient, and they'll take the stripy hand that I can see there, or stripy arm, and then very brief reactions from the panel, and I'll come out again.
There has been a comment earlier on about the opera vanishing without trace. Now, what I think is something like opera, namely a large celebration, large-scale ceremony, has always been around us. We have opera as a particular sound, but even if you look at North Korea, they have these huge marching armies. We're back to the army. And people have obviously some kind of need of creating a thing that is bigger than them, that has this huge impact on a whole other level. Now, even we see in modern culture things like movies like, say, Titanic, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, which is essentially a revamp of the Ring of the Nibelung, are in a way an expression of that need. What I think has changed, however, is that today there are worldwide operating large music corporations who have vested interest in educating the young people, the children of today, to be customers. So they are not really interested in having a competition or a serious competition from either independent music makers, art makers, or the classical music. So in other words, they have barged into education. And that's, in my opinion, where the actual problem lies. There is an interest to move the education to a direction that suits particular partial interests. I think that's where we have to look at.
And yeah, the lady just behind you.
I think I have to apparently watch the speaker for feedback. So I'm Timandra Hartness. I write quite a lot of the reviews for Dolan's website. on opera, so I get to see quite a lot of opera. But two brief points, one very general, which I think, I'm a bit sorry to hear so many of the panel being rather defensive about opera. I had hoped to kind of hear people who work in opera and devote so much energy to it really robustly telling me what is so great and unique about opera. And you know, John, to some extent, did say that it's that combination of everything, and when it works, it's incredibly powerful and involves all your senses in a completely kind of integrated way that nothing else can do. But there's a lot of justifying opera on the grounds that it provides work for working class stagehands, or it's good for the homeless, or you know, a few other things. I think if opera is to survive, it does need, at the very least, the people who work in it to really have a sense of what it is that opera does that nothing else can do, and say it's an art form that only opera can do this. You know, there's all sorts of other things that can provide work for people and so on. But what is it that opera can do? And the other one is more specific and a more personal point for me, is that I really love modern operas, 20th, 21st century operas, largely because the music is more interesting, I think. But I often struggle with them because I often find that they are a bit disappointing as a dramatic piece. The libretto is disappointing because they don't really tell a story that's big enough for the art form that opera is. And opera is a huge art form. It's like a Hollywood movie. It's got huge music and visuals, and it's got people standing there with the most amazing, impossible, unnatural, trained voices doing the most expressive things. And if all they're saying is, do you want another cup of tea? Then that is when opera becomes ludicrous, which is the kind of stereotype of it. But I wonder whether one of the problems with contemporary opera is that people are nervous of telling really big stories. And I'm afraid Dr. Atomic, I love the music, I love the visuals, and the libretto was just an embarrassing mishmash of contemporary documents. I know there's a whole backstory to that, but it was just like, it was like they went, oh, I don't know, it's a huge story. How else do we tell that? It's huge. Let's just get some stuff. And so they're literally singing poetry one minute and the weather report the next. And that seemed to me to sum up a kind of internal crisis with opera. Is we've got this huge art form. We've got the big guns of all the arts here. We've got, you know, an audience waiting. But we're a bit embarrassed. What story can we tell that's big enough for that? And, you know, where are the big stories?
Okay, so I'll take the man with the stripy arm and then very quick thoughts from the panel.
Yeah, it's just a question to the panel. To what extent does the panel agree that amateur operatics, given the talk about cost and value for money, to what extent does amateur opera debase the art form?
Okay, reactions. Why don't you run along this? Nikola, just
I have to say that I don't agree at all with the instrumentalization of opera. I think that nobody starts singing do it because they want to heal sick or increase tourism. I think that they do it because they can. And I think that the art form is purely an expression of your humanity, and there's no purpose except for that. And that's because, in relation to the lady by the door, I think that the opera, or the art of opera, is the most complex art form that ever sprung out of Europe. It's the most difficult combination of different types of art, and everybody has to be an expert, and it all happens in one single moment. You can't really capture it. Movie is two-dimensional so far. Secondly, the point of opera is basically, and has always been, a single person standing over there and struggling with the limit of their body. You have to train it to the absolute limit. What you're doing is basically being a pilot and an academic and an artist at the same time, and that takes decades to train. And that's supposed to sound like nothing, like you're just doing it naturally. And the reason... Yes, exactly. Yeah. You're using the theater as an instrument. No other amplification. And lastly, the reason for this ignorance that I would say I'm critical about is that we as practitioners do not reach out in the way. It's not that people are ignorant. It's that we are secluding ourselves because we are not able to communicate the core value of opera. And we need to learn from sports, from martial arts, to communicate to the grassroots we're actually what the meaning of our art form is, because the government isn't doing it anymore. Yeah, thanks.
Very, very quick thoughts. 1 or 2 sentences, because I want to give more chances to bring people in. Dolan.
Yeah, I'm nothing against amateur opera, but I think the case for opera can't rest on that kind of thing. The case for opera has to rest on the best, on its excellence, on its elitism, and the good sense. So I think if you can say to the government, what can the opera do, or what can opera do for the government? And if talking public subsidy, that is a question, but it has to be what can opera do as an art form, as an aesthetic experience. Not about getting people involved or creating jobs and so on, because if you make it contingent on that, then unless you provide it, you're not going to get anything. So I think it does have to be based on that kind of aesthetic experience, and that's the kind of cultural cringe about saying this is beautiful. That's not something that looks good in an Arts Council funding application, but that's actually the only foundation on which you can justify opera.
Gentlemen here, I don't think you can compare singers. I think whether it's Sting or Barbra Streisand or Damon Albarn or Pavarotti, what people are drawn to with singing is somebody who's got something really individual to say and has got an individual sound. And I think all of those singers, and many more, are totally distinctive when you hear them. I don't think they're necessarily better than anybody else. The lady who's talking about composers, it's really hard finding composers full stop and then composers to write operas. I don't know what the answer is there. We have a few ideas, so watch this space. Sometimes the lady at the back, sometimes the small stories are the big stories for opera. Keep your eye on Two Boys later this season at ENO. And I think there are certain stories that only opera can really tell. Whatever you thought of Dr. Atomic and the libretto, I think that story of the Manhattan Project and the hugeness of that time in the 20th century, for me, could only be put to music and be told as an opera.
There was a really good point made in the debate in Stockholm when we discussed this about the problem of why we don't get a lot of new, big, successful operas being written and composed at the moment, and that the point made was that there were limited opportunities to do so. So when somebody is commissioned to write one, they put everything into it. The kitchen sink, all their ideas for every opera go into this one. And of course it comes out of as a bit of kind of a horrible mess. And that maybe there's a broader culture, not enough people doing it to allow it to be more discreet. But Penny, your thoughts? And then Matt, quickly, and then we'll go out again.
On the Aretha Franklin thing, I mean, I absolutely think Aretha Franklin's a genius, and that it's not a question of one being better than another. I think there are authentic and less authentic kinds of music, and of course there's debatable what they are, but opera is expensive, and one of the things that we have been discussing is whether or not it's worth subsidising something that is in its nature expensive. You've got an orchestra, you've got the visuals, you have singers, there's an awful lot of people involved in it, whereas one singer can actually make a career, just singing on stage with perhaps even just one other person or a cappella. So I think, but it's not to say I couldn't live without Aretha Franklin or hip-hop for that matter. I really love a lot of different music. I think it would have been very dull if we'd all sat here and said how much we loved opera and how it was this complete experience. And one of the challenges actually was thinking, oh God, what to say that might be interesting. So I suppose for me, talking about the class composition people work in opera was something that had surprised and interested me, and I thought might be of interest to some people here, but I'm sorry if it wasn't. That's it.
Matt?
Just on the question of does amateur opera devalue opera? I mean, all of our cast are amateurs, and every single production we've put on has won 4- and 5-star reviews in the national press, so that kind of blows that a little bit out of the water. And there's so much. We're not unusual. There's so much amazing community opera out there, run by all of the fabulous education departments of the opera companies around the world, and it all says something really, really unique, I think.
Okay, so we're going to take another round of questions and points, contributions. Try and keep them brief this time. There's a gentleman down here on my right in a black waistcoat, and then we'll just move up that side to gentleman in black jumper and lady behind him.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Basically, I do remember actually...
Speak into the mic.
Oh, sorry. I do remember having a debate with Tamanda actually on Facebook over the question that she raised, because as she said that she found, and if I am misquoting you, then please leap in and correct me when she said that she found 19th century operas more boring than 20th century operas and stuff, and obviously, that raised my cultural hackles, because my response was, to say, well, was to ask her to explain, and the debate became interesting because the point that she made with regards to the fact that in terms of modern opera, if we want to call it that, has only, if you like, got relatively small stories, as opposed to what was around in the 19th and 20th century, was obviously previously opera was, if you like, part of various national projects in terms of the formation of various nations, the formation of nationalism, the coherence of the national state. Whereas now, of course, we don't have that. The last opera I remember that was actually, I suppose, quite relevant was the one by, and if I've got the name wrong, then please someone correct me, was the death of Klinghoffer by Cage?
Adams.
Sorry, thank you. Well, as I said, yes, something which obviously was about the Palestinians' attack on the liner. Yes, thank you. Yes, on the Achille Lauro and stuff. The only other small point I wish to
very quickly.
Yes, sorry. Is that I was wondering whether anyone on the panel thought that classical music in particular, but opera in general, had, if you like, and again this might seem very strong meat, but had become, if you like, media horse in terms of back in the time of the 1990s with Nessun Dorma. That seemed to be the endorsement of every record company churning out substandard opera pieces.
Okay, yeah. Opera selling its soul, kind of. Opera selling its soul, greatest hits arias. Yeah, okay, thanks. I want to stay tolerant and exclusive in this kind of spirit of opera, but I'll stop being so if people aren't quick. So the gentleman in the back.
Yeah, hi there. My name's Paul Cutts. Like Matt, I'm a former music journalist. I now run an arts charity. I'm also from Barry in South Wales.
You'll be a star.
As was Robert Teare, the opera singer. So I'm in very hallowed company. I was interested in trying to draw three strands together with the conversation that we've had. One, the role of education. Two, instrumentalism, and how opera can or cannot or should not be used to achieve certain agendas, because I think in certain contexts it's entirely appropriate that opera play that role. As long as it doesn't undermine the aesthetic qualities of the work that's produced. And thirdly, the role of commissioning in all of that, and how those three things might be brought together. I mean, John, you touched on the difficulties of finding those composers. One of the things I'm particularly interested in is why when all those three things do occasionally come together, it's never presented on main stages and always done in other contexts. And I wonder if that's something that we might want to look at as well, because if anything is to change the profile of opera, it's actually putting community-led new work on a main stage. And I just wondered if people wanted to respond to that.
Thank you. Lady behind you. And can I see other hands? I just get a sense.
The comparison with an army was made, and in fact I think one of the arguments for keeping large-scale opera or ballet going is exactly it's like keeping a standing army. And apparently when they were keeping, in the war, when they wanted to break the Enigma code, there were people there who did crosswords and there were nuclear physicists. And you never ever know when this sum of human achievement might be needed. And that's not a mechanistic argument for saying we should keep it going. When it works, it's absolutely sublime, and we should do it just because we can do it. And you have this whole, I mean, the singer there spoke about the sort of all the work that goes into becoming the singer. that is the pinnacle. You know, there's one person in the world that might sing or dance like that, and that exists on the team, a huge, huge team, some of whom are driving lorries, some are bolting up steelwork. And I actually work in opera, so to answer the woman there about why we don't validate it, even when I've worked on things sometimes and I see the end result, I think, how did they do it? You know, it just works, and we should do it because we can do it, and not everybody should like it. You know, some people like olives, others don't. You don't get rid of olives.
So there's the gentleman there, and then far back right.
Fascinating debate. I think that, I fully buy the case that opera, does have social and economic benefits, and et cetera, et cetera. I think that the panel, in the end, though, does rest on an elitist view, that this is a sublime, fantastic performance art, which is higher than other forms. Given that we've had a spending review, given that the actual sums for art and culture over the next 3 years is now pretty well fixed, the case for opera is a zero-sum game for other arts and cultural forms. And I'm just interested in what would be if there was to be a continued resource for opera, which would be the panel's forms of art that might get less money to continue to support opera, and on what criteria would you actually make that case?
Very good question. Gentleman at the far back on the right, then we're going to work down this side very quickly.
Okay, I was wondering about the definition of elitism. I would more define elitism as presuming that your genre of music is better than other genre of musics and should stay around for much longer. I, for one, don't think that if opera went away, people would miss it as much as you think they do. I think that there are quite a lot of genres that don't have any funding whatsoever. There are quite a lot of genres that have artists who are completely poor and desolate, but they love their music and they carry on regardless. Why do they not get the money that opera does? Why are you even being funded in the first place, basically? Thanks.
I think we're getting into it now. Okay. Gentlemen.
Yeah, it's to go back to a couple of points that were made earlier, I think it's so much about, context and about lifestyle. And I think those two things play a very important part when you look at how people consume opera outside of this country in particular. But the specific question I'd like to ask is, the media in this country, how could they do more to help opera? And just to give that a little bit of context, if you look back across television across the last 30 years, something like Young Musician of the Year, for example, has actually got to the stage now where if you want to watch the whole concerto, you go and watch it online because you only get snippets in a context that almost seems to be embarrassed to put the whole work out. That's the question. What can we do to change that?
Okay. Gentleman in the red here, and lady here in the front. I think that might have to be it. Sorry.
Yes, about the way the media can help opera, maybe. I wonder, yes, about the way opera communicates with the general public. I wonder, just for instance, how many people in the general public are aware that opera doesn't use, there are no microphones in opera. I wonder to what extent there are many of them who are aware that there are no microphones.
Yep. How many people know that we're not using microphones? Well, I am.
Hello.
Lady here.
I'm lucky enough to earn my living working on the instrument of the building of opera. I thought I'd only ever work on one opera house, and I think we've built about 6 now in different parts of the world. And opera is something that in other parts of the world, particularly in the Middle East and in the Far East, people are wanting more and more of opera houses, and also the activity that goes on in them. But one of the things I learnt recently, which surprised me in this country, is that apparently only 5% of the population here can read music. And that seems to be a fundamental problem for all of us, in that you need lighting designers to be able to read music, to follow the scores for opera and so on. And so it's again back to education, and I think I'm certainly of the generation, and I'm glad to see a lot of younger people here than me, but where singing in the choir and so on was something we all did. there was no question of not learning to read music. So I think that might have a fundamental thing for the future with us.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask the panel to sum up with their very final thoughts, kind of 1 minute each, to bring it together. For me, I think we're going to continue this discussion. If people want to stay in this room, I think there's a discussion after the break on the instrumental value of music, if you like, with respect to social policy. Is that possible? Can the El Sistema phenomenon from Venezuela take off in the UK? So that would be a great discussion. If you can't come to that, you should hang out at the Foyles bookshop, but you should especially come to the reception this evening at Imperial, where we're going to perform some selected snippets of opera. I can feel myself colouring as we admit that we're going to do a couple of arias, but they will be fantastic. We would put on a whole opera for you if we had the time. My kind of final thought on this myself is that I don't think we should ever consider beauty and the business of appreciating beauty to be something elitist. I just, reading for this, found a kind of wonderful quote from Schumann, who was objecting to Wagner's artwork of the future and always talking about creating the new all the time. And he reminded Wagner in a letter to remember that some of the best music, of course, is from the past. And he said, "I shall never be able to consider spiritual beauty in beautiful forms as being an outmoded point of view." I think that's a nice thing to remember. But I'll ask my panel to sum up in the order they spoke, just kind of a minute each. If John, you could kick us off.
Well, no summing up, but I'd like to respond to the two gentlemen at the back who were talking about arts funding and opera and why should opera necessarily benefit more than any other organisation. And in this funding scheme of things, which organisation shouldn't get funding? I think you're absolutely right. I think my view is that it's about quality and it's about imagination, whatever art form you're in. And I think the arts organisations that are going to survive, that are going to keep their funding, that are going to raise more money themselves, are going to be the arts organisations that are really creating, are really reaching out to new audiences and are helping themselves. Our creativity at ENO this season has meant that £3.5 million worth of investment from overseas opera houses has come directly into the company because of the very work the ENO team are actually creating, because of the quality, the imagination and the creativity. And the truth is, the arts organisations across the board who are going to survive are going to be the arts organisations that are ahead of the game, that are reaching out for new audiences, and are going to be creating the best work.
I absolutely echo John's words about quality. The arts organisations that will survive are the ones that work with artistic and social quality, and that's the key for me. Just responding to a couple of the points, I want to fly the flag for chamber opera, an amazing art form which doesn't have to be on the main stage, although I absolutely believe that the main stage works and opera houses should get the funding that they have. But we, along with lots of other organisations, put on site-specific work, which is not that expensive. Our first production cost about £40,000, won fabulous reviews. It doesn't have to be that expensive. And just a little anecdote about reading music as well. Our last commission, Mira Kalix, she won a British Composers Award for My Secret Heart, our last commission. She didn't read music at the time, and she does now. But
Dolan.
I saw a production of Wagner's Parsifal at the Royal Opera many years ago now. I can't remember how many, but it stuck in my mind because there came a moment when the music became particularly hypnotic, when I gradually realised that the entire row, myself included, were rocking backwards and forwards. And I thought, well, yes, okay, opera rocks. But the problem was that this was the row of people who'd been queuing up in the morning for day tickets, which they hold back 67 tickets, I think, every day, so you can go and it's not too expensive. So people who do that obviously are kind of devotees. But there is a passionate audience who knows about opera, or knows enough to enjoy it and gets a lot out of it. The problem is that those seats are all subsidised, either by the state or by the more expensive seats, by corporate sponsorship and so on. And so there is an audience for opera, but it's a bit smaller than the institution of opera. And that's a bit of a problem, and it means that there's always going to be a bit of ducking and diving going on, if not actually kind of slightly immoral wrestling of funds from elsewhere. And when it comes to making that case, it is difficult. But I do think that if we have faith in an art form that actually can move people, that has to be the basis of it, even if there's some skullduggery making it survive. I think longer term, though, if that were to continue, it will die out. The dynamism has to come, I think, not from existing institutions. It's very difficult, I think, to reach out for create a new audience for an old art form. I don't know if that's ever really been done. I think what we need is an equivalent of the Venetian Carnival, of the national public spheres of the 19th century, even of Wagner's milieu, in order to give some life to opera, so that rather than it being about outreach or people trying to commission new stuff, it becomes obvious that there's a scene there that has to be incorporated and can be brought into the big opera houses. So if I were a young composer, I would maybe steer clear of the big institutions and focus instead in trying to generate an audience of my own.
Oh dear, we've just commissioned a 26-year-old composer to write an opera this season.
I'm sure it'll do no harm.
Penny, your final thoughts?
Well, opera's technically incredibly complicated. At the back you're saying, why does it need money? You've got an orchestra, you've got sets, you've got costumes, you've got singers, you've got an idea of what the thing is. All the singers have to be able to see the conductor at all times. I mean, in order to pull this together, it's a sort of huge, both individual and collective effort. And as many people have said, when it works, it's absolutely sublime. And then it's incredibly fragile as well, because at the end of the day, it all depends on these two very tiny little muscles in a singer's throat. They're that size, and everything in the end comes down to that. And so it's sort of combination of kind of human ingenuity and frailty, which I think makes it the marvellous thing that it is.
Nikola?
Well, in response to the lady in the front here, there are actually some singers who can't read music as well. But what that comes down to in relation to what I wanted to say is that there are some great athletes that communicate their art through, for example, the famous Swedish skier, downhill skier, Ingmar Stenmark. He just said, when asked, how do you do it? Will you win all the time? And he says, well, I just do it. And that doesn't remove all the work that he went through. He was the first one to promote physical training in the gym, combining that with the technical training. And that's why he won. And I think that's also how our art form can thrive, to learn from sports, how they communicate and how they communicate with their audience and their practitioners, their athletes and performers. That we are communicating about the art form in an emotional way, in a way that has a direct relation to what you're feeling and seeing and hearing at the moment.
Ask everybody to thank our panel for a really interesting discussion.